Last week was all about painting this tiny German tank hunter. I keep calling it like that because there's just no way I can pronounce this without breaking my jaw. And now it's time to enhance it with some enamel and oil paint effects, namely filters, oil dots, washes, fake shadows and highlights, and some ambient occlusion. What's up, you handsome human beings? It's Uncle Nightshift again. So, right now we have a model that's a little confusing to look at because the wild camouflage does its job properly. That would be fine in real life, but on a model, it just doesn't sit well with me. So let's mess it up a little bit and start with a filter. I chose a tan filter for your standard German 3-tone camo. Luckily it works really well if you have only 2 colors, and I think it would work on a plain dark yellow tank as well. But I found it too opaque for my taste, so I decided to make it more translucent with enamel thinner. Applying a filter over a satin surface is slightly more difficult than on a matte finish. Matte paint will absorb the filter, resulting in a nice even layer. If the surface is smoother, aka glossier, the filter can start pulling around corners and details, which is essentially a wash. But we're making a filter, so the brush must be damp, not soaking wet, and the filter needs to be applied in a thin layer over the entire surface. If it starts to collect around details, just wipe the excess away. The cool thing about enamel filters is that they dry relatively fast. This comes in handy if you want to build up the effect with multiple layers, which is exactly what I prefer. Basically, right after I was done applying the first layer and it was dry to the touch, I applied another one. I find it better to apply 2 or 3 more translucent layers than a single heavy layer, because you never know how much of a filter you're gonna need, and several light ones are easier to control than a single heavy one. So I guess being more patient and just enjoying this simple technique will give you better results. My goal here was to subtly unify both colors and give them a warmer hue. This makes a solid foundation for the next step: oil paints. Some of you kept asking which oil paints to use on the German camouflage, and the answer is simple: those which will work with each camo color. This can of course depend on your personal taste or style, or what look you're trying to achieve. But in this case, and it will be the same with the dark yellow, green and brown camo, different tones of yellow, tan or even white will work just fine, as these paints all work together. If I, for example, decided to blend some green oil paints, they wouldn't work with the dark yellow underlying paint. I also tried adding dark brown into corners to start outlining some fake shadows, but then decided against it because I'll make them in a more controlled manner later in this video. Also, like I said, the choice of colors is highly subjective, and it's quite possible that I'll choose a different selection on another German model. Once you're done blending and the result is quite messy, it's easy to blend the paints further with a completely dry and soft brush. This is normal if the surface is satin or glossy, as it makes blending oils more difficult. The surface is now starting to have a pretty good vibe, and the model doesn't look like a colorful toy anymore. If you think about it, the oil dot technique is just another type of filter, it's just more random. Okay, let's now bring all the details to life with a wash. Again, I find this wash quite thick, and as such decided to dilute it the same way as with the filter. And before anyone asks, no, I didn't seal the model with varnish. I left the oil paints dry for about 24 hours, which ensures most of them will stay in place. Yes, I'm saying most of them because some thicker accumulations need more time, ideally 48 hours to be fully dry. If the surface was completely matte, they would be rock solid in a shorter amount of time. So, what's my reason for being impatient and not waiting for longer? Well, I'm just not bothered by it. It's not like I'm slapping the wash all over the surface, and even if I reactivate the oil paints in a few places, I'm not gonna wipe them away. And also I will apply another layer of oils on top of this. Another thing I'd like to talk about is that I'm sure many of us encountered a situation when you're trying to apply the wash around some complex detail, like in this case around those hatch hinges, and the paint will only collect around the deepest part, leaving the rest untouched. And it's not such a huge deal because again we have oil paints which we can apply in a more controlled manner later. The bigger problem right now is that the model looks kind of sterile. The wash is overwhelming the previous techniques, but again, we're not done yet. Now it's time to make some fake shadows with dark brown oil paint to make the model look more three-dimensional. Yeah, even more three-dimensional than it already is. The application is as straightforward as it gets. Just brush the diluted paint in a small amount into corners and lower parts of the model. Dark brown is a sort of universal color which works with many different paints, and that's why you've seen me using it on multiple occasions on this channel. Right after we're done applying the paint, we can start blending it. To get a nice smooth color transition, it's best to use a completely dry brush. If the paint is too stubborn, a small amount of thinner will help, but then again it's important to finish the job with a dry brush. We already gave this technique a name, ambient occlusion, but in this case I'm creating a slightly different effect. It's more like a color modulation with oil paints. You'll see what I mean when I start applying the highlights. This technique is of course highly subjective, and even though I'm trying to make it look as subtle as I can, someone might still find it unnatural, and that's perfectly okay because it is. But I believe the model will benefit from this in the long run, especially in conjunction with the upcoming effects like chipping and dust. Now I mixed the highlights from these paints, which are the same I used on the oil dot technique. The process is exactly the same as well, but this time I applied the paint on the upper and more exposed portions of the model. Like I already said, this color works with both camouflage colors, although in this case it creates an interesting effect where the green looks more faded, but the yellow looks more, well, yellow. If I was going for a super tight color modulation, I would need to highlight each patch of color separately, green with light green and yellow with tan. I went with this easier approach because it also works partially as a localized filter, which will blend the colors even further, and from what I've already seen on other models, it creates a pretty unique effect once the model is completed. To make it even more interesting, I added light buff on top of the vehicle. These are the most exposed parts of the tank, and I wanted to give them a faded, sun-bleached look. This is another subtle yet quite radical method, but again, the upcoming effects will tone it down significantly, so I think it's important to go slightly over the top in these initial stages of painting. I even highlighted some smaller details with the paint to make them stand out from the rest of the surface. This is all about turning this mass of yellow and green patches into a model that's easier to read, not only for the viewer, but also for the author. It also makes finishing the model easier as we can form a better idea about the weathering and other techniques. When I was done with the highlights, I reapplied the wash in a few places. Mostly into panel lines which need to cast deep shadows, and also around those smaller details like I mentioned earlier. This wash was mixed from the dark brown oil paint I used to make shadows. And I finished it off with some ambient occlusion around hatches and some of the roof details. And that's it for tonight, my friends. The model is now ready for some chipping effects, and I'm quite curious how it will look. I'm also glad I decided to make those fake shadows and highlights, because at first when I finished the washes I wanted to call it a day, but deep down I knew the model won't be as interesting, even if I do my best with chipping and dust effects. So I just decided to push the contrast a little further, and now I know it was a good choice. Anyway, if you enjoyed this video, let me know by giving it a like and leaving a comment. If you want even more content, then consider joining these human beings over at my Patreon page. You can choose different rewards, and you'll be also able to see my progress on this model in real time. Which, if I'm optimistic enough, is probably already finished, or very close to being finished as we speak. I guess that's all I wanted to say, so thank you all for watching, I'll see you mates in the next one, and here are some bloopers. Last week, Surface is now starting to have a pretty good vibe. Again, I find this wash quite thick, and also I will apply another layer of oils on top. Another thing I like to talk about is that I'm sure many of us encountered this. The bigger problem right now is that the model looks kind of sterile. I went with this easier approach because it also works partially as a localized filter, which will blend the colors even further, and from what I've seen on some